Yesterday, UN envoy, new Gaza war may draw in other states. UN decries Israel's excessive use of force in Gaza. Gaza is about to explode, warns UN official. In the last 7 days, UN in warning to Israel as Gaza protests enter fifth week. UN to Israel, refrain from using deadly force at Gaza border. 50 said heard in latest Gaza riots as UN condemns Israel's excessive force. UN envoy calls for action before new Israeli war engulfs Gaza. UN rights chief decries Israel's excessive use of force in Gaza. UN calls for de-escalation at Gaza-Israel border. UN condemns Israel's use of excessive force in Gaza. Israel must stop excessive use of force in Gaza. UN rights chief, UN rights official to Israel, avoid excessive force in Gaza. Israel must stop excessive use of force in Gaza. UN rights chief says UN Middle East envoy, Gaza is a powder keg. UN warns on consequences of Israeli raids on Gaza. UN Mideast envoy warns of danger of war in Gaza. Gaza is about to explode, warns UN envoy. UN special envoy urges to reduce tensions in Gaza. Gaza is about to explode, UN envoy warns Security Council. Gaza escalation risk rising, UN envoy warns. The latest Palestinian UN envoy slams Israel over Gaza. B'Tselem asks UN to stop Israel from shooting Gaza rioters. UN envoy urges action to prevent Gaza escalation. Human rights group urges permanent UN presence in Gaza. Palestine calls for UN probe in Gaza as death toll reaches 39 in the last month. Palestine calls for UN probe into Israeli killings in Gaza. UN Middle East envoy slams killing of Palestinian teen in Gaza. UN envoy tells outrageous Israel to stop shooting children in Gaza. UN human rights experts condemn Gaza protest killings. Caribbean NGOs call on to investigate killings in Gaza. Syria UN commissioner condemns Israeli army killing of Gaza protesters. UN peace envoy meets Hamas leaders in Gaza. US blocks UN call for investigation into Gaza deaths. US blocks Arab-led UN call for independent probe of Gaza riots. Hamas slams US for blocking UN call for Gaza probe. US blocks UN call for Gaza probe for second week. US blocks UN call for investigation into Gaza violence. The UN condemns Israel's excessive force against Gaza protesters. US blocks UN statement supporting Gaza rioters. UN tells concern on Gaza, urges Israel to curb violence. US blocks another UN call for independent probe of Gaza protests. US only Security Council member to block UN inquiry into Gaza violence. US again blocks UN statement on Israeli carnage in Gaza. US blocks Arab-led UN call for independent probe of Gaza protests. UN human rights on Gaza and Guatemala. UN chief urges maximum restraint in Gaza. UN warns against excessive force by Israel. Palestinians in Gaza protests. UN accuses Israel of excessive use of force in Gaza. UN calls on Israel to rein in security forces at Gaza border. Arab delegation demands UN investigates Israel's Gaza massacre. UN rights experts condemn Israel's response to Palestinian protests in Gaza. UN chief urges all parties to exercise maximum restraint in Gaza. UN envoy calls for restraint ahead of new Gaza protests. Arab envoys ask UN chief to launch probe of Gaza killings. UN envoy calls for restraint ahead of renewed protests at Gaza. UN go AWOL on Hamas Gaza march. Arabs ask UN chief to launch investigation of Gaza killings. Israeli fire kills Palestinian at Gaza border. UN urges restraint. UN expresses concern as Israel, Gaza gird for fresh Friday violence. Palestinians tell UN Israel adopted shoot to kill policy in Gaza. US blocks UN investigation into Israeli military killings in Gaza. BT 1/2 UN not collecting information on Gaza violence this time. Spokesperson US blocks UN resolution calling for probe of Gaza border violence. Israel rejects UN call for inquiry into Gaza killings.